everyone, and welcome to The Buck Stops Here. I'm Catherine Murray. Well, with the U.S. midterm elections coming up and President Biden, having a lower approval rating than President Trump, we as Canadians really need to be aware of the changing landscape in the United States, the potential changing landscape, and what policy impact that might have on Canada, our economy, and our outlook. Recall, of course, when President Trump got into power, he ripped up NAFTA, but approved Keystone XL pipeline. And also, of course, recall when President Biden got into power, he shut down Keystone XL pipeline on his first day in office. That, of course, had ripple effects. TC Energy laid off 1,000 people immediately. And of course, that also impacted the potential supply of energy, which we're all feeling the pain at the pump right now. So I wanted to really bring to you today perspectives on what's going on in the United States, how that might impact Canada, and of course, the international markets as well. And for that, Ben Koltun is joining us. He is the Director of Research over at Beacon Policy Advisors, a group that I've been interviewing for over 10 years now. I think it's been 10 years. Ben, great to be with you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Ben, there's a lot to discuss in terms of some of the specifics that impact so many industries, such as the semiconductor chip sector, that of course dovetails into the relationship with China and Taiwan, and also, of course, the energy sector. But why don't I first start by getting you to give us your top-down kind of macro perspective, given the geopolitics and all of the various legislations that are being enacted in the United States. How are you and your team looking at the world these days?
Sure. This has been kind of a remarkable period in kind of American politics the past month. President Biden and Democrats have gamely turned legislative and policy disappointment into triumph, a meager agenda into a transformative one. And the question really is, what is this impact on the world, and how are American voters going to reward what has been accomplished? And so, to be sure, I mean, you just look at this past month, and I think it's one of the most notable months in the 21st century of American policymaking. We've seen with Congress pass the CHIPS and Science Act, this $280 billion industrial policy bill, the largest since before President Ronald Reagan, is a strategic pivot in American policy for bolstering tech and semiconductors against a rising China. We've seen kind of on the domestic agenda, things like gun control, veterans healthcare, the largest since the 1990s. Then finally, Democrats are on the cusp of passing the Inflation Reduction Act, which contains the biggest clean energy push ever, and the first time the government can kind of negotiate drug pricing. And all this is happening kind of with a macro overlay of a lot of improvements in some of the kind of the issues that are front of mind of voters. Inflation didn't increase this past month. The CPI, Consumer Price Index, was flat. Gas prices continue to ebb. Job growth remains healthy. The stock market had another week of gains. And so I think what Joe Biden and Democrats are trying to change the broader narrative surrounding kind of their governing agenda. For voters, the issue above else is inflation. Inflation is far and above for everyone the most important issue, and they're looking for Democrats to kind of act on that. Now, something like the Inflation Reduction Act isn't necessarily going to reduce inflation in the near term, but it's the act of doing some things. And it's kind of changing their agenda that was first, when they first got into office, of Build Back Better, to something that helps reduce prices. So for Canadians are looking at the kind of the energy sector, the Biden and Democrats want to kind of transform and remove oil and gas. But in order to get Joe Manchin's vote, the senator from West Virginia, to pass reconciliation, they've included a lot of carrots for increasing oil and gas leases and trying to open up pipelines. In terms of kind of electric vehicles, they were looking to increase electric vehicles, but kind of make it the supply chain in North America. So for parts that are made in Canada, the United States, and Mexico are kind of part of the issue. And then there's the issue of tariffs, something that is still kind of very much being debated within the Biden administration. Do you provide tariff relief, hundreds of billions of dollars in tariffs from China, from the Trump administration? Do you continue those and hold a leverage point against China as Biden and Democrats look tough on China? Or do you provide some like inflation relief in the immediate term of reducing tens of billions of dollars in tariffs? And so these are kind of questions that Biden and the White House and Democrats are looking to resolve as the midterms are in November. And as much as they're having a positive view of where they are today, it's still very much an uphill battle to keep control of Congress.
All right, we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Ben, I'm curious, just to pick up on your last point, in terms of why you think it would be difficult for the Democrats to continue to have such power in Congress, given the fact that they've achieved, or it seems like they've achieved a lot over the past month. And as you also say, and may I suggest perhaps being on the cusp of passing the Inflation Reduction Act, Americans also understand that some of the reduction costs on the healthcare front don't even come into play for years. Is it because Americans recognize this and that's why it's going to be tough to really win the American vote for the Democrats coming up to the midterm elections?
Yeah, I think Democrats are facing a lot of historical and immediate headwinds in the midterm elections. Just a historical perspective, since World War II, the president's party has lost control of seats in the House and the Senate in every single midterm except for two. And the two instances were in 1998 and in 2002. In both instances, the president's approval rating was above 50%. And Joe Biden's is at 40%. And as you mentioned at the top of the show, it's even worse than President Trump's right now. And so I think with Americans, there is a tendency to not look at the day-to-day legislating. I don't think they can really feel the price at the pump, the price at the grocery store, the price of rent and a mortgage. You can't really have a sense of legislating immediately helping that. And so the midterms are usually a referendum on the party in power. And given that even if there's success in legislating, even if there's like a trend of we've reached peak inflation, there is a more motivation to put a check on the party in power instead of to give them another 2 years of full control of power. And so I think this is what we see with Joe Biden today. His approval rating is very low. Americans are still very disillusioned about inflation. It's the highest inflation in decades. And there was a promise of Biden of a return to normalcy when he beat President Trump in 2020. And even if he's governing in a more typical sense, the output and how Americans feel is far from normal. That we're still dealing with the COVID pandemic. We're dealing with inflation. Crime is up, and there's just a general malaise. And that's not to say that this is the end for Democrats or the end for Joe Biden, but it's typically historical that a party loses seats. And given that how narrow the margins our Democrats have, even if they lose just a seat in the Senate, they lose just 4 or 5 seats in the House, they lose control of Congress. And so that's why even if things are going well in the near term, the broader dynamics are a little more onerous for Democrats for the midterms.
Understood. What do you think that might mean in terms of the impact on policies coming out of Congress going forward, and how that might impact Canada? And, I always like to take a look at energy. And, maybe we even need to look at the Inflation Reduction Act and energy. If the push, and we hear this from a headline perspective, the push is still very much for clean energy, which we all get, we're all on board. It just takes a long time to kind of get to that side. We still need fossil fuels. So where do you think policy is truly on that front?
This is going to be one if Republicans take control of Congress, of the House and or the Senate. Energy is going to be one of the top policies that they want to focus on. They've seen the Democratic lurch to the left in general in progressive policies, but in particular this transition to clean energy. And they're saying, hold on, wait a second, we should not remove fossil fuels in the face of a long-term transition. So they're going to do a lot of regulatory, or they're going to do a lot of oversight into the administration and how they implement the Inflation Reduction Act, and to ensure that fossil fuels are not completely shunted away. They're going to look at the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, that's creating some rules on climate disclosures for public companies, and they're going to try to push back and try to ensure that doesn't get implemented. Or if that does get implemented, then that there's business communities that sue in the courts. And so there is some recognition there is some recognition with the Inflation Reduction Act and with Senator Joe Manchin that you need some fossil fuels. So in the legislation, there was trying to open up leasing for oil and gas. There are tax credits for carbon capture for things that are not typically you see as clean energy like hydrogen or nuclear power. And so there is, if inflation is continuing to be of an issue, and that energy independence in the face of kind of supply chains and kind of more onshoring things and not looking abroad, but working with partners in the North and the South on energy and kind of the supply chains. I think there are avenues here for bipartisan support.
But I just want to pick up in terms of the impact on the energy sector. The policy of allowing more land to be leased for oil production, my understanding, and again from the headlines, it's very limited in scope. So in other words, for anybody who's an energy investor or concerned about inflation, we probably won't see much supply. And of course, it takes years to get more supply. But nonetheless, the leases seem inordinately limited in terms of the impact that it could have.
Yes, that's a very good point in that it's limited right now in scope to areas of like the Gulf of Mexico and Alaska. I think this gets back to one of the defining challenges of Joe Biden. He's seen as a moderate, but in reality, he's kind of a moderate within the Democratic Party. And so he follows in his career, he's been in Washington, D.C. since the 1970s. And he's always found a way to be in the middle of the Democratic Party. But the Democratic Party has shifted left, and as the party has moved left, so has he. And so he has a lot of pressure from progressives to not kind of give an inch on terms of things of like fossil fuels, on things like fracking, on things like pipelines. But that comes in direct conflict in a moment of high inflation with kind of the broader electorate that wants to see they want to see cheaper energy. And the climate change is an important issue, but it's not a front and center issue. And so this is kind of, if Republicans win control of Congress, there may be some more latitude for Biden to pivot to the center because he's not necessarily beholden to the Democrats in Congress if they don't control Congress. And so if there's things like the pipelines, if there's things like kind of more oil and gas, if there's things of just having a more open tone towards kind of the fossil fuels industry while kind of promoting a long-term transition to clean energy or a long-term transition to energy independence. I think there is an opening there for Biden if Republicans win control of Congress. But it certainly is it's a tough balance, and we saw with the Inflation Reduction Act that there's it's kind of it's a half a loaf, or even if that, for kind of fossil fuels. But it was really to appeal to Joe Manchin, as he's also looking for legislation through to kind of reduce permitting times and to reduce kind of the regulatory hurdles for energy projects, which is something that they're looking to do after they pass the Inflation Reduction Act. So these are all kind of incremental things, but it's I think maybe the hope for kind of those who are friendly to fossil fuels, or hope that they have a place in the energy portfolio, that there will be a more openness from Biden come next year.
Okay. No real impact, it seems as though. Fair to say?
Yes, especially in the short term.
Okay. I want to switch over to the relationship with China right now. Big picture, where do you think the United States really is in terms of how aggressive they will be in standing up for Taiwan?
So this is one of the critical components of Joe Biden's presidency. He sees his view of being president as a fight against authoritarianism here at home and also abroad. So you've seen that with kind of bringing the international community together in the fight against Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and you're trying to see that now with China. And this is one of the issues that has pretty strong bipartisan support, that he's being pressured to go even further by Democrats and Republicans in Congress, as you saw with Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. but it's still a very unanswered question that this pivot to Asia, this pivot to China, how far and how much is the Biden administration willing to escalate? Because they are the ones who are actually, I mean, if Congress had their ways, they'd have Biden go even further. So we saw the
What would
chips,
that look like? What would that look like going further?
I think it's a harder line in the sand with Taiwan being more kind of braggadocious or being more confrontational to Xi and the Chinese regime about, you do not cross this certain line, that there is a red line. It's about kind of tariff policy, that it's not just it's not just keeping Trump's tariffs, but even possibly going above and beyond. Um, and there are things like a lot of in Congress of like outbound investments, like prohibiting outbound investments into China if it's a national security interest. And there's this other, just kind of building the tech sector, building the semiconductors, maybe prohibiting a lot of Chinese companies, whether it's drones, whether it's tech, from doing business within the United States. And so I
Great.
think that,
Quick break. We'll
yeah.
be right back for that concluding thought. All right, so Ben, we want to get your concluding thought then on where we see the China-Taiwan situation as it relates to the United States' policies.
Yeah, I think this is one of these issues where Biden, unlike Trump, he needs to rely on the international community. He needs to rely with the partnership with Canada, the partnership with Europe, the partnership with Japan and Korea. And we're long past the day of the Trans-Pacific Partnership being something of a reality. But I think the world is looking for the United States to take kind of a leading role here. And I think Biden is keenly aware of the situation, because if America goes it alone, I think it's there's a problem of a follow through. And as we saw with kind of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Biden is intent on making sure that the world allies have a sign on. And I think this is something that he is trying to do with China. Is a whole different beast compared to Russia, given its kind of geopolitical and its economic power. And so it's going to be a higher hurdle for Biden, and it's going to be a longer term prospect. But you're starting to see kind of the foundation of what a U.S. policy to China is, which is a focus on industrial policy back at home. So less globalization, a more focus on trade partners who have a similar ethos or a similar governing style than kind of authoritarians. And then you're seeing how willing is the United States willing to escalate situations of where they see that's violating democratic norms, whether it's in China or in certain regions of Taiwan, and can they create an international coalition that can stand up to the power of China? And so we're kind of really at the nation stage of this kind of one of these great geopolitical conflicts.
And the changing dynamics, it seems to be happening at a glacial level, but nonetheless, the stage has been set for finding partners with, as you say, the same ethos, quite different from what we saw, I think, under President Trump's leadership in terms of doing one-on-one deals. So let me ask you this: we only have about 2 minutes left, but the elephant in the room, is President Biden going to run again? Is President Trump going to run again? And where do you think the American population stands on both of those candidates? And who would be the candidates to replace either one of those individuals?
Yes. So the American public do not want Joe Biden or Donald Trump to run for president again. Joe Biden and Donald Trump are probably going to run for president again, and they're probably going to be the nominees. I think that Biden and Trump, they both need each other. President Trump, he needs Biden because Biden looks weak, and he has this whole theory that he lost the 2020 election, or that the Biden lost the 2020 election and it was rigged, and that he really won, and so he needs to prove himself again. Joe Biden needs Donald Trump because Biden said he is the only one who can beat Donald Trump, and that's true. That's how he won in 2020. He was viewed as the most electable. and Democrats are deathly afraid of Donald Trump being voted back in office again, and they don't have a clear alternative. And so in the end, Biden's biggest asset may be less about who he is and what he accomplished, and more about who he isn't and what he didn't do, and being that kind of that contrast to Trump. But in the end, there is a lot of talk about alternatives. Beyond President Trump, it's not like the Republican Party is going to move away from Trumpism. It's just, is there someone who can out-Trump Trump? And to that end, there is this one person, the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, who is setting himself up to be an even Trumpier version of the former president. But he's known as Trump without the baggage. And he's a younger version. And if Donald Trump runs for president, Ron DeSantis could plausibly run as well, and there could be a real fight there. Now, if Joe Biden doesn't run again, there's a lot of questions of who would take over for him, and right now it's just unclear. I think the real leading contender is the natural successor, the Vice President Kamala Harris. For all kind of the concerns of her position as vice president, it's a position where people struggle, but she kind of checks a lot of the boxes, and she has a strong support within the Black community, which is an important Democratic constituency. And that, if it's not Biden versus Trump, it could be Harris versus Ron DeSantis come 2024.
Okay, Ben, we got to leave it there. Thank you so much for all of your insight and knowledge. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for watching. We'll see you again on The Buck Stops Here. Ben, thanks again.
Thank you.